Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to start a two-part lecture on stress. And so part one, this lecture is going to be looking specifically at stress and illness. How does stress impact our body? So I want to start by showing you this chart. It was a chart created by a guy named Hans Selye. And this is known as the General Adaptation Syndrome, or sometimes simply referred to as GAS. And it is how our body responds to stressors. And so there are three different phases of GAS. You can see that phase one is what we call the alarm phase. This is when the stressor is introduced to the body. Phase two is the resistance phase. It's when our body is trying to cope with the stressor. And then phase three is the exhaustion stage, when our body starts to break down after the stressor is prolonged. And we're going to go into a little bit more detail about these three phases. In fact, we'll have three slides. We'll have a slide that kind of covers each one and helps you perhaps better understand what this model will look like. It's worth, before I go to the next slide, it's worth copying this in your notes. I have seen Selly's uh, general adaptation syndrome show up on an AP exam in a couple of different ways. I've seen kind of a graph that looks just like this as a multiple choice question, and you had to figure out where some different labels went. And I have also seen specific phases show up on the FRQ. For example, the resistance phase of gas was on the FRQ just a couple of years ago. So be familiar with this chart and kind of the different components. Let's dive in a little bit more detail about these three different elements. So starting with the alarm stage. Mouse. All right, the alarm phase of the general adaptation syndrome. This is when you are introduced to a particular stressor. And what this slide is going to do is it's going to show you that there are lots of different types of stressors in our world. When we're trying to categorize stress, some of our stressors are what we call acute stressors. And acute stressors are things that happen quickly. And the result of an acute stressor is going to be the activation of the SAM system, which we'll talk about in our next slide. But these are sudden stressors that are threatening, that need our immediate attention. We also have chronic stressors, and these are stressors that we have every day that never seem to go away. These are the things that stress us out day in and day out, that we all experience. And you can think environmental demands like the demands of school or your job or the demands at home, things like that. And our body responds to chronic stressors through what's called the HPA axis. And again, we'll talk about that in our next slide. So with acute versus chronic, you can think an acute stressor would be like getting into a car accident, right? Where it happens suddenly and it's very stressful that you have to try to figure out how I'm going to cope with this. Whereas a chronic stressor might be something like your daily commute. And so if you're driving to work and it takes you 15, 20 minutes and traffic is really heavy and it's just stressful and it's something that you deal with every single day, that's a chronic stressor. If you apply it to school, right? Um, if you have a pop quiz that's worth a bunch of points in a really difficult class, that would be an acute stressor. Whereas taking notes, studying, reading the textbook, showing up, listening to lectures, those are all chronic stressors that we have to deal with. And so you can kind of think of your own examples of the difference between acute and chronic stressors. And then we can also categorize stressors as far as what we call like good or bad stressors. Good stressors exist. There are plenty of things in our life that are welcome, that we like, that we enjoy, but are still stressful. And so competing in a sport that you love can be stressful, even though you enjoy the you enjoy the sport. Throwing a party for someone, getting married, having children. These are, for the most part, really great things that we like and we enjoy, but certainly are stressful as well. And then we have distress. And distress is what we probably think of when we think about stress. These are the things that if we could just eliminate from our life, we would like to. These would be things like getting fired from your job, taking tests, having arguments with friends. These are the negative stressors that we tend to experience. So the first stage of gas, the alarm phase, is when you are exposed to a particular stressor. And the second phase, the resistance phase, well, what are we going to do about it? Well, when we have stressors in our life, our body is going to respond in a couple of different ways. One way that our body responds is through the activation of what we call the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. I can't imagine you're going to need to know that full name, but you do need to be familiar with the acronym HPA. And the way that the HPA axis works is the HPA axis is going to release adrenaline into our bloodstream. And this is good. It helps us with kind of our chronic stressors. And so it will release things like adrenaline and then also another stress hormone that we haven't spent too much time talking about called cortisol. And cortisol provides us with the energy we need to deal with stress. And so when you have those ongoing stressors, like maybe you have a teacher that gives you a big report or research assignment that's going to take a couple of weeks and it's this ongoing stressor that you're dealing with, well, your HPA axis, which is slower, will help you cope with that particular stress. The other type of system that our body uses is what we call the SAM system. The SAM system, sympathetic adrenal medullary system, is much faster. It's a very quick response to stress. And this is important when we have stressors that are more immediate, more acute stressors. The example of the picture here is if you're walking through a jungle and you see a lion, well, you're going to need your SAM system to help you react. And so the SAM system, think the sympathetic nervous system. It's going to be the release of norepinephrine into your nervous system. You may recall norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter that prepares our body for action. It puts you into fight or flight, ready to go, ready to tackle this quick acute stressor. So again, our body will react in two different ways depending on the stressor. What's interesting is when you are first introduced to a stressor, like a teacher putting a test on your desk, we would likely see activity in both the HPA axis and the SAM system. In that particular situation, the SAM system would likely be more appropriate because it's right there in front of you. It's a quick acute stressor. A couple more things to note before we move on to this next slide. Cortisol can be damaging. And we'll kind of talk about that when we get into the third slide here, the exhaustion stage. And so think about cortisol, and how low levels of cortisol is great to deal with stress, but high levels of cortisol can be damaging to the body. And the next thing that I would say, or kind of the last thing I would say about the resistance phase, our body does a great job responding to stress. Like our body is designed to deal with stress. However, our body is not great at identifying how severe a stressor is. And so when the teacher puts a test on your desk and you go into this fight or flight mode, your body is responding into as this is something that is very threatening to me. And unfortunately, one thing that happens when we're really stressed is we don't see as much activity in our frontal lobes, what we need for critical thinking. And so you may kind of blank when you're taking this test and then you're thinking I don't know any of the answers even though I knew them last night when I was studying. Well, that's a very real thing that happens. You're stressed out, your frontal lobes aren't firing appropriately, and so you can't think critically. You're having a hard time remembering, and it's because you're stressed. So if you can calm that body down, that will help with some of our test anxieties and things like that. So then the third phase of gas is the exhaustion phase. And you'll see that, as I just mentioned, cortisol, great for handling stress. But if cortisol remains, if we see high levels of cortisol for long periods of time, it can lead to some problems. First of all, prolonged stress can lead to a decline in neural production, and in addition to synaptic connections. And so our brain's ability to work efficiently is hindered. Also, the suppression of lymphocytes or white blood cells. This occurs as cortisol is consistently pumping through our blood. We see this suppression of lymphocytes, and the consequence of that is that it hurts our immune system, and we may be more likely to become sick. So, if you think about if you're like me, I used to always get really sick around final exams and midterms and things, and in my mind, I thought this is such a cruel world. Like I'm supposed to be at school studying, or if nothing else, I'm supposed to be at school taking this really important test. And I would often get really sick around that time. Well, it makes sense. I'm sick because as I'm stressing out about the test, I'm pumping all this cortisol through my body. Well, the cortisol is lowering my white blood cells. And as a result, I'm more prone to getting ill. And then also telomeres. We talked a little bit about telomeres when we talked about aging and development. One thing that we have found is that with prolonged stress, those telomeres shorten. And you can kind of read through the progression here that cells have a more difficult time dividing and regenerating. And the result is it's like you're aging faster. you're not really, obviously, we can't speed up time. That's science fiction, but your body will have this appearance and this similarity to aging at a more rapid pace if you are more stressed. So you're more likely to have gray hair and wrinkles, and you can see the stress that has been imposed on a person. As this aging process kind of progresses. And so I'm going to end with a slide that some people have thought about, and you've maybe seen something similar. But I think that this slide shows kind of this idea of prolonged stress. And that is some pictures of presidents from their first year in office and their last year in office. And the difference that this highly stressful job can make or can put on a person. And so I always think it's really interesting to kind of look at those. And if you look at someone like Lincoln, for example, that was only 4 years difference between those two pictures. But in those 4 years, our country was literally at war with itself. And so you can only imagine the stress that would have on a person. And so, a quick little slide there about stress and how stress impacts the body. If you have questions about this lecture, shoot me an email. Best of luck.